The late summer air in Harmony Creek hung thick and heavy, smelling of dust, overripe peaches, and the cloying sweetness of unspoken fear. It was a border town, a place cleaved in two by a war that had turned neighbors into strangers and strangers into threats. Every loyalty was a gamble, every word a potential betrayal. In a small clapboard house at the edge of town, where the tamed gardens gave way to wild woods, Alara worked by the thin, flickering light of a single tallow candle. Her fingers, though nimble, ached with a deep weariness. The needle rose and fell, a tiny silver fish diving through a sea of sapphire blue cloth. Her belly was a taut drum beneath her apron, the life within a constant, rolling reminder of what she was fighting for and what she stood to lose. For 9 months, since the letter had come confirming her husband, James, was alive and fighting with the 3rd Volunteer Infantry. This had been her war. Not one of musket and cannon, but of needle and thread. She stitched defiance into stripes of white and crimson, and hope into a field of brilliant blue, preparing the flags that a secret contact would smuggle to the Union encampments north of the river. Each stitch was a prayer for James's safety, a tiny rebellion against the gray-clad authority that patrolled their streets and preached secession from the church pulpit. The floorboards of her porch groaned softly. Alara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of blood, dark as a ruby in the candlelight, welled and fell onto the white fabric. A stain, a bad omen. She held her breath, listening. The sound was not the heavy, booted tread of a patrol, nor the familiar shuffle of a neighbor. It was quieter, more deliberate, the groan of a single board settling under a patient weight. Someone was out there, watching. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was no longer alone in her secret. The knowledge settled over her not with a crash, but with a dreadful, creeping silence. Her work, her purpose, her connection to James, it was all compromised. In Harmony Creek, a discovery like this wasn't a matter for a judge and jury. It was a matter for a rope and a stout oak tree. And for a woman heavy with child, it was a death sentence for 2. Out in the darkness, a man she could not see held their lives in his hands. That's a dangerous secret to keep in a town torn apart by war. Before we see who holds her fate in their hands, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The man's name was Silas. He had returned to Harmony Creek 2 months prior, a ghost from a past the town had half forgotten. He wore a dusty, ill-fitting Confederate uniform, his left arm bound in a sling, a fabricated story of a skirmish near Manassas on his lips. In truth, his only wounds were the kind that didn't bleed, the gnawing exhaustion of a man playing a part, the deep-set weariness of a spy. His mission was simple: embed himself in the community, identify the source of the intelligence leaks and contraband that flowed north like a secret river, and dam it up for good. He had been watching her for weeks. Mrs. Alara Hayes, the quiet, pregnant wife of a Union soldier, an object of pity for some, of suspicion for others. He had observed her trips to the Mercer, noting the unusual quantities of red, white, and blue thread. He had seen the flicker of her candle late at night, when the rest of the town was shrouded in darkness. And tonight, through a gap in her worn curtains, he had seen it all, the unmistakable shape of the stars and stripes growing under her determined hands. His duty was clear. He had the proof. A word to Captain Mallory, the ruthless commander of the local Confederate garrison, was all it would take. But Silas did not move. He remained in the shadows of the sycamore tree across the dirt road, the rough bark pressing into his back. His gaze was fixed on the little house, but his mind was 20 years in the past. He was a boy again, rail-thin and feverish, his sister coughing her lungs out beside him in their squalid little cabin. He remembered the gaunt face of his mother, her eyes wide with terror as the town doctor refused to come, calling them vagrants. And he remembered another man arriving in his place. Dr. Hayes, Alara's father, a man who had sat by his sister's bedside for 3 days and 2 nights, forcing broth and foul-smelling medicine between her lips, never once asking for payment. When the fever finally broke, Dr. Hayes had simply patted Silas's head, handed his mother a small pouch of silver coins for food, and walked away. A debt was a debt, and Silas, for all the things the war had made him, was a man who paid his debts. He knew Alara's secret, and as a soldier for the Confederacy, his duty was clear. But a debt was a debt, and this one was long overdue. The following days became a study in quiet terror for Alara. She saw him everywhere. Silas. He was no longer just a shadow on her porch. He was a constant, unnerving presence at the edge of her vision. She saw him at the general store, his eyes lingering on her as she bought flour and beans. He was there by the town well, his gaze steady and unreadable as she drew water. He never spoke to her, never approached her directly, but his presence was a loud, screaming question mark in her life. Was he toying with her, waiting for the most opportune moment to expose her? Or was it something else? Her small home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The unfinished flag lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard, its vibrant colors a mocking reminder of her recklessness. She stopped sewing. The silence in the evenings was worse than the rhythmic prick of the needle. It was a hollow, empty sound that echoed her fear. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Harmony Creek's loyalties were a tangled mess. Mayor Abernathy, a portly man with a perpetually sweating brow, was a fervent Confederate sympathizer who saw Union spies in every shadow. He ran the town with a paranoid grip, his pronouncements on loyalty often delivered from the steps of his large, white-columned house as if he were a Roman senator. Then there were families like the Millers, who had one son fighting for the North and another for the South, their grief and confusion a quiet agony shared over their dinner table. Most people, however, just wanted to be left alone to survive the war with their heads down and their opinions to themselves. It was a dangerous place for secrets. One afternoon, as Alara was leaving the Mercers, she nearly walked into Mayor Abernathy and his wife. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, looked Alara up and down, her eyes pausing on her swollen belly. "Still waiting, are we, Mrs. Hayes?" she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. One must wonder what kind of man leaves his expectant wife alone for so long. Unless, of course, his allegiances keep him from honorable company. Alara's face burned with humiliation and anger. "My husband is an honorable man," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. Mayor Abernathy placed a placating hand on his wife's arm, though his own eyes were cold and assessing. Now, my dear, Mrs. Hayes has her own burdens. We must all pray she bears them with a proper, patriotic spirit." The emphasis was a clear threat. As they swept past, Alara felt a tremor of fear so profound it made her knees weak. She leaned against the storefront, her hand going to her stomach. When she looked up, her eyes met Silas's. He was standing across the street, watching the exchange. For a fleeting second, she saw something in his expression, not malice, not threat, but a flicker of, what? Pity? Understanding? Then it was gone, replaced by the same stony mask he always wore. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, not to her, but in the direction the Abernathy's had gone, and then turned and walked away. The gesture was ambiguous, unsettling, but it was the first time his presence had felt less like a threat and more like a shared observation of a common enemy. The thought was so strange, so dangerous, that she immediately pushed it away. He was the enemy. He had to be. A week later, the unspoken tension between them finally broke. A late autumn storm rolled in with unexpected fury, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. Alara had been trying to secure a loose shutter on the west side of the house when the wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it against the wall with a loud crack. She cried out, more in frustration than pain, and struggled against the gale, her dress plastered to her. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the blowing rain. It was Silas. He didn't say a word. He simply took the shutter from her, his good hand firm and steady, and with a few deft movements, secure it back in place. He then noticed the woodpile beside her door, the logs soaked and the axe lying where she'd left it. He picked up the axe, and despite having only one functional arm, began to split the larger logs with powerful, efficient swings, his body moving with a grim economy of motion. Alara stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, the rain dripping from the eaves around her. She watched him bewildered. This was not the act of a man waiting to spring a trap. This was an act of help. When he had a small pile of drier, split wood, he carried it and stacked it neatly by her door. He finally looked at her, his face damp with rain, his expression unreadable. "You should be inside," he said. His voice was rough, low, as if he wasn't used to using it. I can manage my own affairs," she stammered, the words sounding weak and ungrateful even to her own ears. He grunted, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That shudder says otherwise." He paused, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was comfortable. "The nights are getting colder. A woman in your condition needs a good fire." Before she could form a reply, he turned and walked back into the deluge, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Alara stared at the neatly stacked wood, her heart pounding a confused rhythm against her ribs. Fear and suspicion warred with a nascent, terrifying flicker of gratitude. That night, for the first time in a week, she pulled the unfinished flag from its hiding place. The bloodstain on the white stripe seemed less like an omen and more like a testament to her own fragile humanity. As the fire Silas's wood fed crackled in the hearth, she began to sew again, her movements slow and deliberate, no longer just for James, but for a future she couldn't yet imagine. The day after the storm, Alara awoke to a world washed clean. The air was crisp and cool, and the scent of damp earth filled her small house. The quiet kindness of Silas's act had unsettled her more than any threat. It was a complication she didn't know how to navigate. As she swept the porch that morning, her eyes strayed to the road, half expecting to see him, half praying she wouldn't. Her prayer went unanswered. Around mid-morning, a small detachment of Confederate soldiers rode into Harmony Creek. They were led by a man whose reputation preceded him, Captain Mallory. He was a wiry, severe man with eyes like chips of flint, known for his zealous pursuit of Union sympathizers and his utter lack of mercy. The town grew silent as they passed, shopkeepers disappearing into their stores, mothers calling their children inside. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw Silas among them, standing near the town well, speaking quietly with Mallory. He was no longer the quiet, wounded neighbor. He was one of them, his gray uniform marking him as a man with authority and allegiance. He belonged to them. A wave of cold dread washed over her. Had his kindness been a ruse after all? A way to lull her into a false sense of security before delivering the killing blow. She forced herself to go about her day, her movements stiff with anxiety. She needed to deliver the finished flag. Her contact, a farmer who sold his goods at the weekly market, was expecting it by Friday. It was Wednesday. The presence of Mallory's patrol made the task infinitely more dangerous. Late that afternoon, as she was tending to her small vegetable patch, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Captain Mallory himself, flanked by two of his men. Mayor Abernathy hovered behind them, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Mrs. Hayes," Mallory began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We are conducting inquiries. It has come to my attention that you have not been forthcoming in your support for our glorious cause." "I am a widow in waiting, Captain," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly as she rose to her feet, wiping her soiled hands on her apron. "My husband is away fighting for the enemy," Abernathy interjected, unable to contain himself. Mallory silenced him with a sharp glance. "Your husband's misguided loyalties are his own shame. It is your loyalty we are concerned with. There is a current of treason running through this town, madam. A flow of information and contraband that aids the aggressors. You live alone. You keep to yourself. You receive no mail. It is an ideal situation for someone with something to hide." Alara's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the accusation. She could see Silas standing at a distance, near the road, his face a stony mask. He was watching, listening. Her fate was being decided right here, in her own yard, and he was doing nothing. The bitterness of betrayal was a sharp, acidic taste in her throat. "I have nothing to hide," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a surge of desperate defiance. "I'm simply trying to survive until my child is born." Mallory took a step closer, his eyes scanning her small house, the woodpile, the path leading into the woods. "We shall see. Be assured, Mrs. Hayes, we shall be watching you. We will root out the rot in this town, one way or another." He turned on his heel and strode away, his men falling in behind him. Mayor Abernathy gave her one last, triumphant sneer before scurrying after them. Alara stood frozen, her entire body shaking. She felt stripped bare, exposed. Her eyes found Silas again. He had not moved. He met her gaze across the distance, and this time there was no mistaking the expression in his eyes. It was a clear, unmistakable warning. The captain's visit hadn't been a random inquiry. It was a direct consequence of Abernathy's suspicions, and Silas was now caught in the middle. He had subtly tried to steer Mallory away from her during their conversation at the well, framing her as a harmless, grieving woman, but Abernathy's persistence had forced the captain's hand. He had failed to deflect them, and his look conveyed a single, stark message. They are serious. The danger is real. He was not her accuser. He was a spectator to a drama he had tried, and failed, to prevent. The encounter with Captain Mallory lit a fire under Alara's fear. The flag, hidden beneath her floorboards, felt like a live coal that could ignite her life at any moment. She had to get it to her contact. The risk of keeping it was now greater than the risk of moving it. Her opportunity came 2 days later on market day. The town square bustled with a fragile, almost frantic energy. Farmers hawked their produce, women bartered for goods, and children darted between the stalls. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, the tension was palpable. Mallory's men were everywhere, their gray uniforms a constant, sober reminder of the occupation. They moved through the crowd, their eyes scanning faces, their presence dampening conversations. Alara had wrapped the flag tightly and concealed it in the false bottom of a large wicker basket, covered with a layer of late-season apples and jars of pickled beets. The basket felt impossibly heavy in her arms, not from its physical weight, but from the gravity of its contents. Every step she took toward the market square was a battle against the urge to turn and run back to the relative safety of her home. She saw Silas almost immediately. He was standing near the blacksmith's forge, ostensibly watching the smithy work, but she knew better. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze missed nothing. He was observing the patrols, the townsfolk, her. Their strange, silent dance of observer and observed continued, but the steps had become more complex, more dangerous. She didn't know if he was there to watch her succeed or to watch her fail. Her contact was a man named Elias Vance, a stoic, grizzled farmer with kind eyes and hands as gnarled as oak roots. His stall was at the far end of the square. To reach him, she had to walk directly past a group of soldiers lounging near the courthouse steps. She lowered her head, making herself as small as possible, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Well, well, if it isn't the little Unionist sparrow, the voice was Mayor Abernathy's. He had positioned himself beside the soldiers, clearly enjoying his proximity to power. "Selling your wares, Mrs. Hayes? I trust they are all locally sourced." The soldiers chuckled. Alara's heart pounded. She ignored him, her eyes fixed on Elias Vance's stall just 50 feet away. "That's a heavy-looking basket for a woman in your state," Abernathy continued, his voice rising. "Perhaps you'd allow these fine gentlemen to inspect it for you, to ensure you're not overburdening yourself. Captain Mallory is very concerned about contraband, you know." He was playing to the soldiers, trying to force their hand. One of them, a young corporal with a cruel mouth, pushed himself off the steps and swaggered toward her. "The mayor has a point. Let's see what you've got in there, ma'am." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alara. This was it. She was caught. She clutched the basket tighter, her mind racing for an excuse, an escape. Then, a new voice cut through the air, calm and authoritative. "Corporal." It was Silas. He had moved from his position by the forge and was now standing just a few feet away. The corporal turned, surprised. "Sir," he said, instinctively recognizing the quiet authority in Silas's tone, even if he didn't recognize the man. Silas gestured vaguely with his good hand. "Captain Mallory is looking for you. He's over by the livery. Something about a new patrol roster." The corporal hesitated, looking from Silas to the tempting target of Alara and back again. The desire to harass a helpless woman warred with the fear of a superior's wrath. "Go on," Silas said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "Don't keep the captain waiting." "Fear one." The corporal grumbled something under his breath and trudged off toward the livery stable. Silas then turned his cool gaze on Mayor Abernathy. He said nothing at all. He simply looked at the mayor, a long, level stare that seemed to peel back the man's bluster and expose the petty, frightened creature beneath. Abernathy's smug expression faltered. He sputtered for a moment, adjusted his collar, and then scurried away, melting back into the crowd. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute. Alara stood, trembling, her knuckles white on the basket handle. Silas had just saved her. Openly, he had drawn attention to himself to deflect it from her. He met her eyes briefly, and in that fleeting moment, the message was no longer a warning, but a confirmation. He was on her side. Why? She didn't know, but the fact of it was as solid and real as the cobblestones beneath her feet. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the ebb and flow of the market, leaving her to complete her mission. With a deep, shuddering breath, Alara continued toward Elias Vance's stall, her steps more certain than they had been all day. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, tense rhythm. Silas's intervention at the market had been a turning point, transforming their silent, suspicious orbit into a fragile, unspoken alliance. He made no grand declarations, nor did she offer any words of gratitude. Their communication remained in the realm of gesture and deed, a language more suited to the dangerous world they inhabited. He took to performing small tasks around her property, always under a plausible guise. He would appear at dusk to chop firewood, claiming his own supply was damp. He mended a broken fence post along her back pasture, muttering something about preventing his non-existent cattle from wandering. He never came inside, never asked for anything in return. These acts of service were his way of watching over her, of maintaining a protective perimeter around her isolated home. Alara, in turn, began to leave things for him on her porch. A loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm from the oven. A jar of apple butter. Once, after she saw him shivering in the autumn chill, she left a thick woolen scarf she had knitted years ago for James. It was a dangerous gift, intimate and telling, but she left it anyway. The next day, she saw him wearing it, the dark gray wool stark against his Confederate coat. It was a secret they wore in plain sight. During these quiet weeks, they learned each other through observation. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the way his hand would sometimes drift to his slung arm, as if to a phantom pain. She saw him not as a Confederate soldier, but as a man weary of war, a man carrying burdens she couldn't guess. He saw the fierce, protective set of her jaw as she went about her chores, her movements growing slower and more deliberate as her pregnancy advanced. He saw her tending the small, pathetic grave of her pet dog with a tenderness that spoke of a deep capacity for love and grief. He saw the single-minded determination that fueled her, and he began to understand that her loyalty to the Union was not about politics. It was about love for one specific Union soldier. It was a motive he could respect, even if it was for the opposing side. The external threat, however, did not diminish. It grew. Captain Mallory, frustrated in his search for the source of the leak, doubled his patrols. Mayor Abernathy, humiliated by Silas at the market, channeled his resentment into a focused, venomous surveillance of Alara. He was a man obsessed, convinced of her guilt and determined to prove it. One evening, Silas appeared at her fence line just as she was bringing in her washing. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the sky. Abernathy was at the garrison today, he said, his voice low, not looking at her, but at the darkening woods. He's formally accused you. He told Mallory he has a witness who saw you meeting with a known Union courier in the woods last month. Alara's blood ran cold. The flag. The meeting with Elias Vance. Someone had seen. It's a lie, she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't. Mallory doesn't care if it's a lie, Silas continued, his voice grim. He cares that it's an accusation. It gives him the pretext he's been looking for. He's planning a full search of this property, not a polite inquiry like last time. They intend to tear it apart. They're coming at dawn. Alara swayed, her hand flying to the fence post to steady herself. Dawn, she breathed. The words sounded like a death knell. She had another flag hidden, this one only half finished, along with scraps of cloth and spools of the telltale thread. There wasn't enough time. He wants to make an example of you, Silas said, finally turning to look at her. The last rays of sunlight caught his face, illuminating the stark gravity of his expression. The pretense of the wounded neighbor, the quiet handyman, fell away completely. In its place was the man he truly was, a Confederate intelligence officer facing a crisis that pitted his duty against his conscience. They will hang me, she said, the words flat, devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. No, he said, his voice sharp with an intensity that startled her. They won't. He moved closer, his presence a shield against the encroaching darkness. We don't have much time. We have to hide everything. Every scrap of blue cloth, every spool of red thread. We have to give them nothing to find. For the first time, he used the word we. It hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across an impossible divide. In that moment, they were no longer Union and Confederate, observer and observed. They were two people bound by a shared secret, standing against a common, relentless enemy. The life of her unborn child, and perhaps his own, depended entirely on the trust they could forge in the few short hours before the sun came up. The game was over. A new, more desperate one was about to begin. The world shrank to the four walls of her small cabin, illuminated by the frantic, dancing light of every candle and lamp she owned. The approaching dawn was a physical pressure, a weight on Alara's shoulders. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the edges of her composure, but Silas's presence, grim and focused, kept it at bay. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice a low command. Without a word, Alara knelt, the movement clumsy and difficult, and pried up the loose floorboard beside the hearth. She pulled out the half-finished flag, its colors shockingly bright in the warm light, along with her sewing kit. The spools of thread, the spare needles, the carefully folded squares of fabric. The evidence of her treason lay bare on the floor between them. Silas stared at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he looked at her. "Is this all of it?" "Yes," she whispered. "Every scrap." He nodded, his mind already working. "The woods," he said. "It's the only place. We'll bury it deep." He began to gather the materials, his movements swift and efficient. But as he bundled the flag, his eyes fell upon a small, framed amber type on the mantelpiece, a serious young man in a brand-new Union uniform. "James!" Alara saw him looking. "That's him," she said softly. "My husband." Silas held the photograph, his thumb gently brushing away a speck of dust from the glass. He looked from the determined face in the picture to the equally determined face of the woman before him. For a moment, the soldier in him receded, and only the man remained. "You love him very much." It wasn't a question. "He is my whole world," she replied, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. This is all I can do for him." A profound silence filled the room, thick with unspoken things. In that moment, Silas understood completely. Her rebellion wasn't for a government or a cause. It was an act of desperate, unwavering love. It was a reason he would not betray. He gently placed the photograph back on the mantel. "Then, we had best make sure you are here when he returns." The resolve in his voice was absolute. And in that instant, another truth was revealed as stark and clear as the evidence on the floor. He wasn't just helping her to repay a debt to her father. His motivations had become entangled with her, with the fierce life she carried, with the quiet strength he had come to admire. The debt was the reason he had started, but it was not the reason he was staying. He wrapped the cloth and thread in a piece of oilskin. "Stay here," he commanded. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He slipped out into the pitch-black night, a shovel in his good hand, the bundle tucked inside his coat. Alara pushed the heavy bar across the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was alone again, but not truly. She was trusting her life, and the life of her child, to a Confederate spy. She began to scour the cabin, searching for any stray thread, any forgotten scrap of fabric, her hands shaking as she worked. An hour later, a soft knock came at the door, a specific rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. The signal they hadn't known they needed until now. She slid the bar back, and Silas slipped inside, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with him. He was breathing heavily, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "It's done," he said, "buried near the old creek bed. They'll never find it." Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over Alara. But it was short-lived. "It's not enough," Silas said, his eyes scanning the room, seeing it now as Mallory would see it. "Just because they find nothing, it won't stop Abernathy. He'll keep pushing. We need more than an absence of guilt. We need proof of innocence. Or, at least, proof of loyalty." He fell silent, his mind racing. Alara watched him, her own mind a blank slate of fear. What could they possibly do? Then, an idea began to form in Silas's eyes, a desperate, audacious gamble. He walked to the chest in the corner where she kept her spare linens and blankets. He opened it and rummaged through, pulling out a plain white sheet and a length of red flannel. He laid them on the table. "Where did you get the blue for the Union flag?" he asked. "The Mercer," she said, confused. "An indigo dye from Charleston. Do you have any left?" She shook her head. "No, I used it all." He swore under his breath. His eyes darted around the room again, landing on the dark blue woolen shawl hanging by the door. Without asking, he took it down. The fabric was coarse, a different texture, a different shade. It would have to do. He took a knife from his belt and, with painstaking precision, began to cut the fabrics. A long strip of the red flannel, a clumsy square from the blue shawl. "What are you doing?" Alara breathed, watching in horrified fascination. He didn't look up from his work. "Abernathy has a witness. Mallory has an accusation. When they arrive, they need to find you working. They need to find you sewing a flag." He paused, placing the pieces of fabric together on the table. A crude, misshapen mockery of a familiar pattern. But it has to be the right flag. He was crafting a Confederate battle flag, a lie made of cloth and thread, a shield to be sewn by her own hands. The plan was terrifying. It was brilliant. It was their only hope. He looked up at her, his expression grim, his eyes boring into hers. "Can you do it? Can you sell the lie?" Alara looked at the picture of James on a mantel, then at the crude pieces of enemy colors on her table. For her husband, for her child, for the man who was risking everything to stand with her in the dark. She took a deep breath, picked up her needle, and nodded. Yes. Dawn broke gray and cold, chasing away the shadows, but bringing with it a more tangible dread. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of burnt-out candles and the silent, screaming tension of two people braced for impact. Alara sat at her small table, the half-finished Confederate flag draped over her lap. Her hands felt alien, her fingers stiff and clumsy as they pushed the needle through the coarse blue wool. Every stitch was a betrayal of her heart, yet every stitch was a prayer for survival. Silas stood by the window, a sentinel watching the road. He had removed his sling, his arm now resting stiffly at his side, the better to appear ready for a fight he couldn't have. He had coached her, his voice low and urgent in the pre-dawn gloom. Look afraid, but not guilty. You're a woman alone, terrified by soldiers bursting into your home. Let them see your fear. Let them mistake it for weakness. The sound came first, the thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth, the jingle of harnesses. Then they appeared, a phalanx of gray, ghosts materializing from the morning mist. Captain Mallory was in the lead, his face set like granite. Beside him, almost vibrating with vindictive glee, was Mayor Abernathy. "They're here," Silas said quietly. He moved away from the window, taking up a position near the hearth, just another object in the room. The pounding on the door was violent enough to shake the entire cabin. It wasn't a knock, it was an assault. "Open this door in the name of the Confederate States Army." Alara flinched, a genuine tremor of fear running through her. She looked at Silas. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Now." She rose slowly, letting the flag slide from her lap onto the table, and walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she lifted the bar. The door flew open, and Mallory filled the frame, his men crowding in behind him, their bayonet rifles making the small space feel impossibly crowded. Abernathy pushed his way to the front, his eyes darting around the room, hungry for evidence. "Mrs. Hayes," Mallory said, his voice a whip crack, "you have been accused of treason, of giving aid and comfort to the enemy. We are here to search this property." His eyes, and Abernathy's, immediately fell on the table. They saw the pieces of red, white, and blue fabric. They saw the needle and thread. They saw the flag. Abernathy's face fell. For a moment, he was speechless. What is this?" he stammered, pointing a trembling finger. Alara clutched her hands together, letting her voice shake. It's a flag, sir. For the cause." Mallory stepped forward, his cold eyes scrutinizing the clumsy piece of work. The stitches were uneven, the blue square cut from a different, coarser cloth. It looked exactly like what it was, a rush job, made from scraps by an amateur. "Abernathy," Mallory said, his voice dangerously low. "You told me she was a Unionist traitor. This does not look like the work of a traitor. It's a trick," Abernathy shrieked, his composure shattering. "A ruse. She knew we were coming. Someone warned her." His wild eyes darted around the room and landed on Silas, standing silently by the fire. He warned her. He's been skulking around her property for weeks. This was the moment Silas had been waiting for. The accusation against him was the key to his entire gambit. He pushed himself away from the hearth, his expression one of weary disdain. "Of course I warned her, you fool," Silas said, his voice cutting through Abernathy's hysteria. He turned to Mallory, his tone shifting to one of a fellow officer making a report. "Captain, I warned Mrs. Hayes that her lack of patriotic display was attracting unwanted attention from gossips and meddlers. I suggested, for her own safety and to quell damaging rumors, that she make a more visible contribution to the cause." He gestured to the flag on the table. "I commissioned this work from her myself. A test of her loyalty, you might say. A test I believe she is passing, despite being harassed at dawn by puffed-up town officials with overactive imaginations." The insult hit its mark. Abernathy turned purple with rage. Mallory's eyes narrowed, shifting between Silas and Abernathy. He was a man who cared about results, not small-town squabbles, but an accusation against one of his own, even a semi-official operative like Silas, could not be ignored. "You commissioned it," Mallory challenged, skepticism clear in his voice. "And who, exactly, are you to be commissioning flags and testing the loyalty of citizens?" The question hung in the air. This was the precipice. Silas had to sacrifice his cover to save her. "Silas Kane, Captain," he said, his voice steady. "Special Services, reporting to General Longstreet's command. My orders are to investigate and neutralize threats to our supply lines in this sector." Quietly, he met Mallory's gaze without flinching. Mayor Abernathy's public spectacle and baseless accusations against the wife of a soldier, even a Union one, are a threat. They stir up dissent and waste valuable military resources. My assessment is that Mrs. Hayes is what she appears to be, a frightened, pregnant woman trying to survive. Her only crime is being a convenient target for this man's paranoia. He had laid it all on the line, his identity, his mission. He had turned the tables, transforming himself from a suspicious lurker into a superior officer and Abernathy from a concerned citizen into a bumbling nuisance. Mallory was silent for a long, tense moment. He looked at the crude flag. He looked at the trembling Ilera. He looked at the sputtering, apoplectic mayor. And he looked at the cold, steady eyes of the man claiming to be a fellow officer. To doubt Silas now would be to question the entire command structure, to risk looking like a fool who couldn't control his own territory. With a sigh of profound irritation, he made his decision. "Abernathy, you have wasted my time," he snapped. "Get out," he turned to his men. "The search is off. We're leaving." The soldiers, looking relieved to be done with the matter, filed out of the cabin. Mallory paused at the door, giving Ilera one last, long look. "See that you finish it, madam," he said, gesturing to the flag. "And see that it hangs where it can be seen." Then he was gone. Abernathy stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and utter defeat. Silas walked over to him, his presence radiating a quiet menace. "If I hear you have so much as looked in Mrs. Hayes's direction again," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I will personally see to it that you are charged with obstructing a military operation. Now get off this property." The mayor stumbled backward, turned, and practically fled. Silence descended. It was over. They were alone in the small cabin, the morning sun now streaming through the open door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The ugly ersatz flag, the symbol of the lie that had saved them, lay on the table between them. Ilera slowly sank into her chair, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror and relief. She looked at Silas, this man in an enemy coat who had just sacrificed his mission, his safety, and his identity for her. The debt to her father had been repaid tenfold. This was something more. This was a choice. He walked to the door and closed it gently, shutting out the rest of the world. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing himself firmly on her side of it, and the consequences of that act were still waiting for them in the quiet that followed the storm. The silence that filled the cabin was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a world reformed, of lines blurred and allegiances broken. Ilera stared at the Confederate flag on her table, a talisman of a desperate lie. Her hands, which had trembled with fear, were still. She was alive. Her child was safe. Silas stood by the hearth, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go clear to his bones. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the stark reality of what he had done. He had exposed himself, undermined a local authority allied with his cause, and shielded a Union sympathizer. In the eyes of his superiors, his actions were treasonous. He finally moved, walking to the table. He picked up the flag, his expression one of disgust, and tossed it into the fire. The cheap fabric blackened and curled, the enemy colors consumed by the flames until nothing was left but ash. The act was a final, definitive statement. Ilera raised her head, her eyes meeting his across the small room. The gulf that had separated them, of uniform, of cause, of suspicion, had vanished. In its place was a profound, raw, and deeply human connection forged in shared peril. All the unspoken words, all the gestures and quiet deeds of the past weeks, culminated in this single, silent moment of understanding. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was not a whisper, but a clear, steady tone that held the weight of all he had risked. He gave a slight, weary nod. There was nothing else to say. The magnitude of his sacrifice was too great for platitudes. He had paid a debt that had long since been settled and incurred a new one to his own conscience. He began to move around the room, his actions simple, grounding. He picked up a chair that had been knocked aside by the soldiers and set it upright. He straightened a rumpled blanket on her cot. He was erasing the violation, restoring a small measure of peace to the space they had defended together. Ilera watched him, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. She was no longer just a frightened woman waiting for her husband. She had faced down Captain Mallory. She had played her part in the lie. She had found a strength she didn't know she possessed, a resilience born of desperation and a fierce, maternal will to protect. She was a survivor. Silas stopped at the door, his hand on the latch. His time in Harmony Creek was over. To stay now would be to invite questions he couldn't answer and to put her in even greater danger. He had to disappear to become a ghost once more. He paused, his back to her. "The road east is watched less carefully," he said, his voice low. "If your contact need the new route, tell him to follow the crooked creek past the old mill." It was a final gift, a piece of intelligence, a path to safety. He turned then, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than grim resolve or weariness crossed his face. It was a look of profound regret for a life he couldn't lead, for a connection he had to sever. "Be careful, Alara," he said. He used her name not as a stranger, but as a friend. He opened the door and stepped out into the morning light, not looking back. She rose and went to the doorway, watching him walk down the dirt road until his gray-clad figure was small in the distance, eventually disappearing over the rise. He was a man who had worn the enemy's coat, but had carried a righteous heart. Alara stood there for a long time, the cool morning air on her face. She looked at the picture of James on the mantel, and then at the empty road where Silas had vanished. Her world was still uncertain. The war was still raging, but the suffocating fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. She had been saved by the most unlikely of saviors, a Confederate spy who had chosen honor over orders and a debt of kindness over the duties of war. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the gentle flutter of life within. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the unmistakable glimmer of hope for the future that life represented. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and it was the beginning of a new day. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.